Story 1. The Shadows of the Abandoned House. The first time I heard about the house was during a visit to my aunt's house, in the small town where my family used to gather for Thanksgiving. It was a cold November afternoon, the air filled with the scent of pumpkin pie and the sound of laughter echoing through the old house. However, this time was different. My cousins were talking about a house, an old, isolated one on the hill where our grandparents had spent the last years of their lives. The story was intriguing but also frightening. They said that for many years, Thanksgiving dinners were always held there until one day everything stopped. The house was suddenly abandoned and no one ever explained why. My cousin spoke of the strange shadows they'd seen, doors that would close by themselves, the sound of footsteps upstairs when the house was empty. They seemed to speak of something more than just superstition. It was then that the idea emerged. Why not spend the next Thanksgiving there? See it to believe it, they thought. Reluctantly, I agreed to go with them. The night we arrived, the sky was covered with thick clouds, hiding the moon. The house looked darker than I had imagined. It was large, with an old wooden structure that creaked with every gust of wind. The garden was overtaken by overgrown vegetation, and the broken windows looked like empty eyes, watching our approach. I felt uneasy, but I tried to push the feeling aside. After all, it was just an old house, right? We entered through the front door, which creaked open with a deafening snap, as if the house had been waiting for our arrival. The smell of mold and rotting would fill the air, but there was something else too. Something sharp, almost metallic. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, as if they were more than just reflections of our flashlights. The laughter and conversation began to fade, as we all felt the tension in the air. Something was wrong, but no one wanted to admit it. We decided to set the table in the dining room, and that's when things began to get strange. As we prepared the food, I started to hear a sound, a low murmur, as if someone were whispering my name. It was faint at first, barely audible, but soon it grew louder, as if coming from the walls. I looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it. The sound was familiar, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. When the table was set and everyone sat down, the feeling of unease intensified. The candles flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. My uncle tried to start the prayer, but his voice faltered, and he simply stopped, staring at the door. We all turned our heads. The dining room door was slowly closing on its own, as if someone were pushing it from the other side. None of us dared to get up and investigate. Something deep inside me told me we shouldn't. The dinner was tense, silent, and everyone seemed nervous. But it was after the main course, when we were all resting and talking about nothing in particular, that something truly horrible happened. I was sitting by the window, looking out at the empty field beyond the house. That's when I saw it. For a fleeting moment, a dark figure moving across the wall outside. It was large, like a human figure, but much taller than any of us. I quickly looked at the others, hoping someone had seen what I had seen, but no one seemed to notice. The conversation continued as if nothing had happened. I felt fear creeping up my spine, and that's when the whispering started again, this time louder, clearer. The words didn't make sense, but there was something about them that filled me with panic. Suddenly, one of the candles on the table went out, and the room grew noticeably colder. My cousins started looking around, their eyes wide with fear, and that's when a scream tore through the silence. The dining room door burst open violently, and a skeletal figure appeared in the doorway. It was an old man with a pale face and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce our souls. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, but his presence was undeniably macabre. He didn't say a word, just stared at us for a few seconds before disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. No one moved, no one breathed. The house was silent again, but the fear was now palpable. At this point, everyone wanted to leave the house, but something kept us from moving. It was as if the walls were trapping us, as though some invisible force was keeping us there. The night seemed endless. When we finally managed to leave, we didn't look back. We knew there was something in the house, something that was watching us, something that would never let us go. Some say the house was cursed ever since the disappearance of the patriarch, my great-grandfather, during a Thanksgiving dinner many years before. His spirit, or whoever it was, still wanders the halls of the house, searching for something. Perhaps he was waiting for us. Perhaps he was still waiting to take us. What happened that night will never be forgotten. The house remains there on the hill, empty and silent, but I know it's not uninhabited. And now, every Thanksgiving, a part of me wonders if we'll ever hear the whispering of those shadows again. Story 2. The Last Thanksgiving. It was a dark, rainy afternoon when my uncle invited me to join the family for Thanksgiving that year. The family would gather, as usual, at his house in the countryside. I hesitated for a moment. I knew things weren't right there. But the idea of spending the holiday with family and forgetting about the problems drew me in. However, when I arrived at the house, a strange feeling overtook me. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. My uncle's house was isolated, far from any neighborhood, surrounded by a dense, thick forest. He always said he loved the peace and quiet of the place, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But that year, the house felt colder and quieter than ever. The windows were covered and a thick fog rose from the ground, giving the house a ghostly appearance. When I stepped inside, I could feel the heavy energy in the air. Something didn't feel right. Throughout the evening, as the others prepared for dinner, an increasing discomfort followed me. Quiet conversations forced laughter, and a strange silence hung over the table. My aunt, normally warm and welcoming, seemed distant, as if she was somewhere else, far from all of us. My uncle, who had always been the charismatic host, kept glancing toward the kitchen door, as if waiting for something or someone that wasn't there. It was during the prayer of thanks, when everyone had their heads bowed, that I noticed the first strange thing. I felt a presence behind me, something so tangible that it was impossible to ignore. My eyes shifted to the window, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow quickly crossing the wall of the house. It wasn't anyone's reflection from the table. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the fear began to consume me. Dinner continued in silence. I couldn't stop looking at the kitchen door, where something seemed to be moving behind the curtains, as though someone was watching. When I finally asked my uncle what was going on, he simply forced a smile, saying it was just the old house playing tricks on our imagination. But it wasn't just that. I knew there was more. That night, while everyone settled down to rest, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the wood creaking and the wind hitting the windows created a sinister atmosphere. The silence was absolute, but soon it was filled with whispers, as if the house was speaking. I tried to get up to find out where the sound was coming from, but something paralyzed me. An invisible force held me back, as if the house was telling me not to leave. But something inside me, an unsettling intuition, pushed me out of the room. Through the dark hallways, I followed the stairs leading to the upper floor. I knew something was up there. As I climbed, the feeling of not being alone intensified. A strong, rotten smell enveloped me. When I entered the hallway, My uncle's bedroom door was ajar, and for a moment I saw a tall, pale figure moving through the room. I couldn't make out the details, but the eyes were bright and empty, like those of a creature that didn't belong in that place. Panic took over, and as I looked back, I saw my aunt standing at the end of the hallway with a cold, empty smile on her face. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, in a voice that wasn't hers. At that moment, I realized my family wasn't there anymore. They were being consumed by something that came from the house, something that had latched onto them, waiting for years perhaps, something that now wanted to take me too. I ran downstairs, and when I reached the door, I realized I couldn't open it. The windows were sealed, and the air was growing heavy. The whispers grew louder, filling every corner of the house, becoming deafening. I looked back and saw the shadows stretching from the depths of the house, as if they were closing in on me. The house was alive, and it didn't want me to leave. When I finally managed to open the door and ran into the yard, the heavy rain hit me like a punch. I looked back and saw the house lights flickering. A feeling of relief washed over me as I breathed in the fresh air. But when I looked toward the horizon, a tall, hooded figure was approaching me through the forest. The fear didn't subside. The house kept calling. That was the last Thanksgiving I spent at my uncle's house. I never went back, and I never looked at the holiday the same way again. Something in that house marked me, and I knew I could never forget what I saw. My family, I don't know what happened to them. I never heard from them again after that night. All I know is that sometimes, when the night is silent and rainy, I feel the presence of that shadow around me. Something that tells me it's still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Story 3. The Thanksgiving Spirit. I've always loved Thanksgiving. It was a time to gather with family, reminisce about special moments, and celebrate together. But that year was different. I was away from home, spending the holiday with friends in a small cabin deep in the woods, far from civilization. They invited me to escape the routine, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to relax. I never imagined it would be the last Thanksgiving I'd truly celebrate. As soon as we arrived at the cabin, something felt off. It was an old building, full of history and quirks. The furniture was worn, the wood creaked under our feet, and the smell of mildew mixed with the aroma of food being prepared. But what bothered me the most was the feeling that there was something else there, something that didn't belong. It was as if the air was charged with an energy I couldn't explain, and even though everyone tried to act normal, I knew they felt it too. On Thanksgiving night, everything was ready. The table was full of food, the fireplace crackled in the background, and the conversation flowed with laughter and stories. But around the table, I noticed that something wasn't quite right. With every glance toward the window, every smile, there was a tension in the air. Something was out of place. No one spoke about it, but everyone seemed to know that something was waiting. As night fell, the wind outside began to howl strangely. The sound seemed to echo through the walls of the cabin, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. Then, in the middle of dinner, I heard a noise coming from above, a creaking, as if someone were walking on the second floor of the cabin. I looked at my friends, but they were busy eating and laughing, oblivious to what was happening. I decided to get up and investigate. I slowly climbed the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. At the top, I noticed a door slightly ajar. The light from the lantern I held flickered, and the air felt heavier as I approached. When I opened the door, what I saw made me freeze. The room was empty, but the smell of something decayed and rotten filled my nostrils. The floor was covered in scratch marks, as if something had been dragged there. But the strangest thing was the presence. I felt something watching me, even though there was no one there. I left the room, but as I turned to go back down the stairs, a soft, desperate scream echoed through the house. I looked down at my friends, but no one seemed to have heard it. The sound continued, louder, more distinct. The scream was coming from the basement. I knew I had to see what was happening, but a deep fear overtook me. I decided not to tell anyone. My curiosity consumed me, and I went down to the basement alone. The stairs to the basement were dark and narrow. Each step creaked, as if protesting my decision. When I reached the bottom, the air was even thicker. A sense of dread hit me uncontrollably. The light bulb flickered before going out completely. In the dark, the silence was absolute until something brushed against my leg. The touch was light, but the shock made me jump back. My heart raced, and I swung the lantern, trying to find the source of the touch. That's when I saw it. A small, misshapen figure stood in front of me, tucked into a corner. Its white, lifeless eyes stared at me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, fear choking me. The figure didn't move, but its presence paralyzed me. I knew I wasn't seeing a real person. This wasn't human. The lantern flickered again, and when the light returned, the figure was gone. I ran up the stairs to the safety of the main room, where my friends were still talking, unaware of what was happening. I was out of breath, sweat dripping down my forehead. I tried to explain what I had seen, but no one listened. Everyone seemed to be in a trance, as if they were being drawn into something they couldn't control. It was as if they were being possessed by a strange presence, pulling them away from reality. That night, the spirit of Thanksgiving wasn't one of gratitude and celebration. It was the spirit of a dark presence that fed off our tension and fear. The scream I heard wasn't from a friend, but from someone or something that had already been consumed by the house. We were in its domain, and it wanted to swallow us whole. When morning finally came, everyone was exhausted and silent. No one touched the food, and the cabin felt emptier than ever. The next morning, as we left the place, one of my friends quietly remarked, "Did you guys notice that no one said anything this year?" No one said, "Thank God." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt the weight of what we had experienced. The spirit of Thanksgiving that night wasn't one of gratitude, but of a presence that fed off our distress. Since then, every time the holiday rolls around, I feel a shiver run down my spine. That Thanksgiving spirit is still with me, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more chilling mysteries, subscribe to the channel Disturbing Stories, share this video with your friends, and click like to show you're ready for more. Don't forget to activate the notification bell so you never miss any upcoming videos, because the mysteries are just beginning. See you soon, and stay alert, because the next nightmare could be closer than you think.